All right, ladies and gents, we're gonna go and get started here. If we can keep mics muted, except for those presenting until we get to the Q&A session, that'd be fantastic. Introduce Stan Conte, who's a physical therapist and athletic trainer with over 24 years of experience in the MLB, as well as several years at Santa Clara University and 4 years as a physical therapist in the Army, which is probably one of my coolest facts about Stan, and the fact that he received 2 medals of commendation during that time. He's authored or co-authored over 15 research articles and serves on the MLB research committees. He plays a key role in the Collegiate UCL study, which we're going to talk about a little more next week when we have Mark Rothermick on. But his primary goal right now is consulting in the MLB regarding medical research and running Conte Sport Performance with his son, Nick.
Thank you. Great. Can we get that? There's a PowerPoint. Listen, I apologize, first of all. Probably should have my son here to do the technical information. No technology works with anyone over 60 years old. That's just a rule of the universe. So I apologize for not being able to do this the correct way. First of all, I want to thank all the athletic trainers in the Division I program that participated in our UCL study. This was a really cool study. We got a lot of information out of it. We've done it for 3 years. We had 294 out of 296 Division I baseball programs that participated. That's unprecedented in regards to the percentage of people who not only agreed to do it, but actually did it. We got 100% response from those 294. And that's just sort of unbelievable. When we were looking at your responses, we just couldn't believe it. So we've done it for 3 years, and Mark is going to talk about that next week. Unfortunately, we're having to stop the study because we don't have baseball going on at the college level. So we plan to wait 5 years and then publish the data. He'll give you all the results on it. He's done a great job on that. And so again, I really, really appreciate that. What we're going to talk about today is really throwing programs. I'm using the UCL as an example of how to put in a throwing program. So kind of trying to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Sort of the when, why, and how of what's going on. Can you turn the slide? Okay, so what we see here, this is in the professional ranks. As you know, there's not that much great data at the collegiate and high school level. Some dribbles here and there. That's one of the reasons we started that study. But in this one, at the pro level, we've spent a lot of time looking at this using the HITS data, which is an injury surveillance system that Major League Baseball has used since 2010. And what you can see here on the left-hand side is the graph going up. So when you start thinking about the UCL epidemic in regards to incidents, you see it really started in 2008. People didn't start noticing it until 2014. But you can see that that blue line is the major and minor leagues. The red line is the major league number of UCL surgeries, and that greenish line is minor leagues. And what you can see on the right-hand side is that as with just about everything with the UCL, the younger player is the one that's having more of the Tommy John surgery. That's a percentage, major to minor league, of UCL incidents. So you can see it's really ramped up in the minor leagues. Change the slide. Can you change the slide? Okay, and that's go to 2016. So if you think it's evening out, it's not. 2017, in 2016, there's about 160 surgeries done at the pro levels. 17, 179, in 2018, 196. You also see an increase in the number of major league people. So this is a continual problem at the pro level, and it definitely is a problem at the college and high school level. Next slide. Before we get into the actual throwing program, I think it's important to really talk about how you prepare your player for this. And everybody will talk about the kinetic chain. Everybody in this group understands the importance of the kinetic chain. What happens a lot, at least what I see, is that people like to go to the throwing program before they're really completed with the strength conditioning and integration of the kinetic chain. Next slide. So this kind of talks about this, but what we really talk about is the scapula, and we're going to emphasize a little bit here on the scapula because everybody talks about scapular dyskinesia and the importance of having a good scapula, but what we see is it's really hard to change, and people kind of move on without getting it the way we need to. So, um, and scapular dyskinesia is the number one cause of shoulder and elbow pain, but I think it also influences the whole kinetic chain in a throwing motion. Next slide. Okay, so there's the serratus, but when you look at some of the articles, Kibler, who I think invented the scapula, and has written more articles than anybody else on that, talks about the importance of scapular movement and activation of the serratus and the lower trap with deactivation of the upper trap. And this is something we kind of forget. That activation of the upper trap elevates the scapula and puts it in a really bad place. So you really need to get serratus and lower traps working together, but at the same time deactivating it. And there are other studies on EMGs that show that there's a relationship between close kinetic chain exercises, the lower extremity, and the serratus. Next slide. So this is that study. Cower in 2014 did a study on EMGs, and they found that this particular position activated not just the serratus anterior, of course this is a throwing position, but also activated the glutes and the lower extremity. So there's a connection between the serratus anterior and in fact the lower extremity core and legs. And that's why we think the serratus is so important. Now, a lot of the stuff that we've gotten is stealing some of the exercise programs from PRI. So PRI talks about the scapula coming around and floating on the rib cage, or the rib cage floating on the scapula. So we've used a lot of those techniques to try to activate serratus. Next slide. Okay, so these are some exercises. Just go ahead and click that. Yeah, click both those buttons. Okay, so this is actually how we start, and we start on these exercises. If this is a knee or an ankle injury, we start with the serratus. This is serratus against the wall, kind of pushing in a serratus punch type thing, and then doing it a quadruped. And you'll see on the right-hand side, that is not what we want to see. We don't want to see the kyphosis. We want to see the serratus and the scapula moving around the rib cage. This sometimes takes 2 or 3 weeks to actually get them to be able to do this correctly and not activate their upper trap. Next slide. Just go ahead and click all the videos on. Okay, here's just some other exercises just to give you an idea. Serratus, we use a bow and arrow type thing with the TheraBand, doing serratus punches. Click the next one. And here's what we call a reverse bow and arrow, where you get a serratus punch and then you push the palm in. And here are some ones that is what we call a bear progression. If you can click on those videos, you'll see what we do is we do a serratus activation and then start bringing the knees up and do a bear crawl, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, going side to side, front and back. This is a real critical exercise because it really integrates glutes, core, and upper extremity together, and it's really hard to hold from an endurance standpoint. Next slide. Next, okay. And here's one where we're trying to integrate the lower extremities with the serratus. So there's a lunge with a bow and arrow serratus punch, using mountain climbers with stability on the upper extremity. If you have an unstable shoulder, these are unbelievably great stability exercises. And then a modified mountain climber using slide pads up the track. Next slide. Now, again, more integration with the serratus and the lower extremity. Okay. So you can see just kind of the progression, kneeling with a kettlebell and pushing up, and then a lunge and one arm, and a lunge with 2 arm lifts. Next slide. Okay, this is a little bit more advanced. Turkish get up is one of the best exercises around. You got to teach it right. This is just a half a Turkish get up on the left side. Hit the middle video, please. Okay. So this is a simian crawl that we teach up and down. upper extremity with glute activation, and the last one is a stabilization in a bear crawl type position with the knees up and on a 360 balance. Sometimes we'll use perturbations with that as well. Again, for a shoulder that is unstable or has instability issues, like a slap tear or something like that, these are really, really good exercises. Next. Okay, so that's my push on some of the importance of kinetic chain work and that kind of thing. And really, when you're having a Tommy John surgery, people always say, "Well, what do you do with these guys?" Gosh darn, they come in every day and kind of get bored. Well, they don't get bored with these exercises. We worked them pretty hard with a lot of different exercises, a little more challenging, and try to increase their endurance and strength all the way through. So when to start a progression in a throwing program, whether it's a Tommy John surgery, whether it's someone coming back from shoulder surgery, one of the things you have to remember is nothing puts more strain on the UCL than pitching, than throwing. If you want to be a grocery clerk or a gas station attendant or whoever, you don't need your ulnar collateral ligament. Ulnar collateral ligament was put there in order to throw. So, and the throwing portion of this is the most critical parts. Now, generally speaking, 4 to 4.5 months to start throwing post UCL. We're going to talk about that in more detail. And for a repair, it's 11 to 12 weeks. Next slide. The graph on the left is sort of this classic slide we use in almost every Tommy John presentation, and it shows the relationship between the increase in velocity and the number of UCL reconstructions that occur. And you can see that velocity has a lot to do with this. And I'm kind of setting the stage for why we think we need to do the throwing program the way we do. And that is, velocity puts more strain. Now, there's been a ton of articles. Christopher Camp has written a couple articles, Glenn Fleisig and Kevin Wilk also, in regards to the velocity aspects and varus torque. So as it's intuitive, and everybody who works with baseball players knows this, is that the harder you throw, the increase in velocity, the more stress on the ligament. Next slide. Okay, so again, redundant, but that's how much I think about the importance of kinetic chain strengthening. Next slide. So most of the programs that you see when you look, if you Google throwing programs, you get a program like this. A lot of them was based on Mike Reinold and Kevin Wilk's program, as well as Judy Saito out of Curlin Job. And it kind of gives you, nice phases. It's a good protocol, general, something to follow. Of course, you have to individualize them, but it really doesn't talk too much about intensity. Next slide. So most programs are based on perceived exertion. So you go out and you start throwing with a player and you say, I want you to throw at 50%. Okay. So what we've shown, this is an article that we published not long ago, but other people have published similar articles that show that perceived exertion is really unreliable, inconsistent, and really shouldn't be used. So when you ask somebody to throw 50%, they're actually throwing about 75 to 83% of their max velocity. That was Fleisig's study. You can cause more valgus stress early in a throwing program because you don't know how hard you're throwing. Remember, velocity equals stress. Next slide. So hit the slide again. Okay, so this is way back in 2002. So that was 20 years ago when Wilk wrote this in one of his papers. When pitchers are asked to throw 50%, they throw 83%. When they're asked to 75%, they're throwing 90% of their max velocity. I mean, we would never, when you say 50%, you wouldn't want this guy to throw 80% of 90, which is 72 miles an hour on his first day. You wouldn't do that, okay? But when you ask for perceived exertion, you have no idea exactly how hard they're throwing. Next slide. Okay, so let's talk about timelines here a little bit in regards to when you start throwing, first time throwing, what the distances are, first mound, breaking ball, curve balls, and when do you do simulated. So a lot of people do different things. What we did is we went into the hit system and pulled out 583 records of pitchers who had Tommy John surgeries and looked at the athletic training notes So everybody, as everybody knows, you write a note every day, and we got a lot of information on what their throwing program was in that. So we went through 583 of them. Didn't take more than a couple days, and we started looking at when they started throwing. Next slide. Okay, so these are times and distance for first throwing, and we're going to talk about average versus median. I like median better. Average is sometimes the outliers, especially got people who take a long time, will skew the average, where median is a little bit more middle of the road, taking the two ends of the bell-shaped curve off. So looking at 582 records, 4.7 months was the average they started throwing. So that kind of goes a little bit to Kevin Wilkes' original thing way back in the 80s, that about 4.5 months you can start throwing. We've changed that a little bit to 6 months, and we'll talk about why we do that instead of the 4.5 months. The distance that they threw on their first throw, almost 70% was at 45 feet, and it was over 80% between 60 and 45. That makes perfect sense. Next slide. Okay, so what about flat ground? Now, we define flat ground as throwing on flat ground down to a catcher. So it's not just being on flat ground, it's flat ground to a catcher. The average was 8.5 months. The median was 9.5 months to do that. As you know, most of the time when you go to flat ground with a catcher down, you're increasing velocity. So that's why that is a little farther out there. How about the first time you get on the mound? And that's 9.2 months. And notice also the difference. We didn't have available records on everybody on the flat ground, but we had a lot on the off the mound. And we know that the mound is a big goal for every pitcher. I can't wait to get back on the mound. And we're going to talk about a little bit more of why we actually put them on the mound earlier than 9.2 months. Next. Okay, time to the first changeup, 10.3 months. And average in months, 10.9 months to breaking ball. It's logical to do the changeup first. That's been shown by multiple biomechanists that the changeup has less varus torque on the UCL. So that's the first pitch to go to. And then the time to simulated game. A simulated game could be in a practice, or it could be in a rehab game in a minor leagues from a professional. And that's 11.7 months, almost 12 months. So when you start looking at this, you start thinking, well, these guys get back in 12 months. Well, they don't get back in 12 months. Looking at over 1,400 reconstructions, dating all the way back to Tommy John in 1974, we looked at this, and the median number was 14 months. So whether people were going shorter or longer or anything else, the median was 14 months. And this is why we really pushed the idea that the goal is really to get them back to competition in 14 months. What happens when you say 11 to 12 months? You speed up the program, which means you have to speed up the throwing program, and that throwing program is the most dangerous part. So if if we started at 6 months instead of 4.5 months, what are you missing? Nothing. More time to get the kinetic chain together. At 6 months, you then have 8 more months to get this guy to competition. And there's not a rehab person out there in the world says, I can't get a guy ready in 8 months. So what we're trying to do by 6 months is actually increase the maturity of the graft. We don't know how strong the graft is. So so at 4 months, it's got to be weaker than 6 months. We're talking about a tendon changing into a ligament and having to do cell replacement to take the tendon cells out and put the ligament in. We have some information from ACL reconstructions that shows it takes up to a year to replace those cells and for maximum strength in the ACL. We haven't done that with the UCL, so that's why we think 14 months is right. Okay, next slide. Okay, so how do you measure stress on a ligament? Okay, there's a kind of different ways you can do it. Perceived exertion, which if you take home one thing from this talk from me is perceived exertion is my grandson says this, it's poo-poo. It's poo-poo. Don't do it. Radar gun, a Motus sleeve, a Rapsodo, Kenetrex, TrackMan, what you have. Most of those are not that mobile. Rapsodo, you can move around. Motor sleeve, you obviously can move around. The radar gun is inexpensive and easy to use, and I'll show you how that goes. Next slide. It's easy, it's portable. I use the pocket radar. I have no financial arrangements with the pocket radar. I found it 6 or 7 years ago. It looked like a cell phone, so I didn't want to have the big radar gun, and it's been pretty consistent. We've put it against the stalker, and it's consistent. And when it says 93, it's reproducible at 93. The stalker might say 92 or 94, but it's definitely within plus or 2 miles per hour based on the little stuff that we looked at. You can actually download on one of them, so you don't have to write things down or do anything like that. It's an easy method to teach pitchers to limit velocity. Now, this is really, really important. This is where the athletic trainer, the rehab therapist, all this where you really come in, and this is where you earn your money. Granted, not enough money, but you earn your money. And that is, you have to teach the pitcher how to stay within the range. Everybody gets excited. Like when I first produced this at an ASMI conference, everybody went, "Oh gosh, no, not a radar gun. That's going to make them throw harder." No, actually, when you teach it, you teach them how to throw easier. So you start off and you start giving them feedback in regards to what they're throwing. At 45 feet, we put this radar on a tripod so we can catch the guy while we're doing this, and we can see the thing, and we'll say, that's 40 miles an hour, that's 45 miles an hour, that's 50 miles an hour. I want you to stay right there at 50. Now, the key, of course, is good mechanics. Initially, when somebody does that, they kind of baby, I don't know if you guys can see me, but kind of baby the throw. You got to get them to have full good mechanics, even though when they're throwing. And at 45 feet, 50 miles per hour is firm. It's firm. It's not a looping. It's really firm, and they can keep their mechanics. And you have to teach them that. Then when you start moving up, you give them feedback on every pitch of what they're throwing, so they know if they're increasing or decreasing. If we make the velocity, eventually we move our ways up to 60 miles an hour, they'll start off with warming up, and we'll say 45, 47, 50, 52, 55, 60, 62, 64, go back down to 60. It is unbelievably amazing that these guys can really zone in on the velocity with good mechanics. And once they've got it, they've got it. If you're at 50 miles an hour one day and the next day you come back and want to throw 50, they will be able to ramp up and stop right at 50. They have that good biofeedback. And what allows you to do this too, if you're throwing at a low velocity, you can get more throws in. Number of throws is not a problem. So you can start improving endurance at sub-maximal throwing, just like you can do with weights. So you can throw more throws in a session. Now, what happens if you start going up? You decide you're going to increase 5 miles an hour, and you go from 55 to 60, and they have a little discomfort in their medial side. Okay, typically you would stop. Okay, you're done for the day. What we do is we go down to 55, the pain goes away, and I can continue throwing on the throwing program. So it allows them to do this. And now you can do this with shoulder problems. You can do this with different problems. You use the radar gun to be your monitor, and you keep it underneath any pain. And when you have no stress and no pain, you can throw more throws at that velocity and then slowly go up. Now, what about distance? Now, personally, I don't go much past 90 feet on a pitcher. A position player and a catcher are totally different. But there's no reason for me to go way back. Now, people will say, what about our long toss programs? And we can debate that in other ones. I don't see a ton of value in increasing velocity or strength with long toss. Now, Jaeger would grab me by the throat and kill me for saying that. But in pitchers, I don't go much more than 90. I use the velocity as their intensity, and that's how they get back on the mound. And go from that. So next slide. Okay, keep going. Just run up this whole thing. Right there is good. Oh, one back, sorry. Okay. Now, I talked about going on the mound, and this is important. Slinker in the Elytras group out of Collegiate wrote an article in 2014. Used 29 college pitchers, and they threw a distance up to 180 degrees hard on the line. And then they eventually got on the mound and on flat ground and looked at their biomechanics. And what they found is that shoulder and elbow stresses showed no difference between flat ground and the mound. Okay, so there's always this big thing, as I said before, about getting on the mound. And people were worried because people can get on the mound and their adrenaline's flowing because it's their first time. They want to light up the radar gun. Well, if you've taught them all the way now you can get them on at 70 miles an hour, which is a firm, off the mound, and then now you can start working on pitching mechanics, because I don't see anybody in high school or college or professionals who are not throwing off a mound. So when you throw off a mound, you want to work on mechanics and be off the mound as much as you can. The problem, of course, is if you're throwing maximally, you can't get on the mound maybe once a week or maybe even 2 times a week. But we get them on the mound sometimes as soon as they're able to throw 70 miles an hour with no pain. We put them on the mound, and we put them on 2 or 3 times a week on the mound. So it's the same as flat ground, but now we're using the mound. And when you read the Slinker article, basically at the end of their discussion, they said the mound's your friend, and that actually makes sense when you start thinking about a downhill motion if the mechanics are good. Next slide. So this is sort of what we've done using this. We actually did this and correlated with the Moda sleeve one time in spring training with the Dodgers. My son did that study. One, to really validate what we were seeing on the radar gun was similar to the Moda sleeve. That's been, of course, done again by several people, including Christopher Camp out of Mayo Clinic. So that's kind of how it works. And then you don't have to hold it. There's a continuous mode on the radar gun, and you just put it right behind him with a tripod, or right in front of you if you're the catcher, and you can see the miles per hour and give that back to the player. Next slide. This is one back. Sorry. Okay. This is a study that was done by Fleisig. I just put this in because to actually show more ideas about the mound. For Major League Baseball, Fleisig did this study, lowering the mound and raising the mound to see how kinetics and kinematics changed. And what he found was it didn't change. And so a flat ground or a higher mound, as much as you want to think about good or bad, it's about the same, which goes again to putting him on the mound early, as long as there's no pain and you can control the velocity, is a good thing. Next slide. And when you look at progression, on the left is like the perfect progression. You could increase every day as you go. These are all days, actually. And this is the right one is the one that we do over a 14-month program. We give them actual breaks in between. So we raise them up to a peak. We give them a break. Then we come down to about 3/4 of what their previous peak was and build them back up and take them all out. Those breaks in between are only breaks from throwing, not from conditioning. That allows them to mentally and physically recover from the throwing programs. So this is kind of a template for what we try to do on a 14-month program. Next. Okay, so my theory on going slower, you got one more. And one more, it'll pop up the picture. Okay. There's decision of when and how hard to throw is the biggest potential problem. That's why we take this out to 6 months. We think it's a month and a half to 2 months later than what is usually done. They're generally not objectively controlled. We control them with the radar guns. Again, we don't start at 4 months because we're not sure with the strength of the graft. Now, that doesn't mean we know the strength of the graft at 6 months either, but we think 2 extra months of maturity of the graft is better than less. Perceived exertion is inaccurate, and radar guns or a better technology is required. So if you're out there without measuring intensity, in all due respect, I think you should consider doing something else. whether it's a motor sleeve, whether it's some other device, or it's a radar gun. The radar gun's the easiest. You can put the darn thing in your pocket, and I guess that's why they call it a pocket radar, and use it really, really easily. And the players, when I first did it at the major league level, they thought I was nuts. And then after them getting to it, there was no resistance to using it. In fact, the days that we went out there and we forgot the radar guard, they made us go and get it. So you may get resistance from people, especially when they say, I can't throw that easy. They can, they just haven't tried. Next slide. Last one is like, why do we give a crap if they have a setback? What does it matter? Well, this is a great study that just came out, 2018, by Keller, once again, the Elatrosh group. And what they did is all the people that they had done UCL reconstructions, 317, they looked at them and they asked them, have you ever experienced medial elbow pain during rehab? Almost 50% said yes, okay? And the average time that they said that they got this was 9.75 months. It's in the middle of the throwing program, especially when you're increasing intensity, okay? So who cares? Well, here's why we care. Almost 20% underwent subsequent elbow surgeries, and only 7% had no pain when no subsequent injury surgeries who didn't have pain. So having pain is not normal. It's not normal in the throwing program, and there's consequences of having medial elbow pain. You have a higher risk of going on for another elbow surgery in the future. Next slide. My opinions, I think you got them. I think I've said them. Throwing shouldn't start to 5.5 months. I actually have moved that out to 6 months. Every velocity should be measured. Mound work is okay. It's good. And this is an old slide. I should have fixed it. Out to 120 feet. It's really I've adjusted that to 70 miles per hour before you put them on the mound. And the goal is 14 months. Now, in colleges, they get back a little bit quicker. If you look at the Kane article from 2010, they get back in about 11, 12 months. I don't criticize anyone for getting someone back in 12 months, but we're talking to the general population, the middle of the bell-shaped curve. And if we can figure out the strength of the graft or at early rehab or a stronger procedure is proven. I wrote this a couple years ago, and what you're finding now is that, of course, the internal brakes on the repair is one thing, but actually what we're seeing now is hybrid reconstructions where you're doing an internal brace on a reconstruction with a graft. So you're enhancing that graft by putting a internal brace on top of it. Will that increase or decrease the amount of time before you can get back? It might, but we're still at the beginnings of that. Next slide. Thank you. Hope I did. I think I went a little long. I apologize.
No, not a problem at all, Stan. Are you good with the slideshow?
Yeah. If the people liked it, I liked it. It was good.
So at this point, obviously, we're going to jump forward, and if anybody has any questions for Stan, try and be polite to everybody else that's going to jump in and try and ask some questions one at a time.
Hey, Stan, good job. Quick question. When we were talking about the throwing program and that periodization, you were talking about rest. How much rest are you looking at at each phase?
In the pro thing, it works. It kind of works nicely with holidays like Thanksgiving and Christmas, spring break, those kinds of things. So typically, it was about 7 to 10 days. But especially if they went home, we had to make sure we monitored them, as you guys know, to make sure they were actually still doing their condition. Anybody have any questions about repairs?
If nobody else has anything, Stan, from the
Stan,
rehab side.
Hey, Jason. Sorry, Stan.
Nope,
I had
you're
a
good.
question about repairs. Do you keep the same time frame with throwing on the repairs?
No, based on Kevin Wilkes' work, who's done more repairs than anybody else, the rehab, it's about 11 to 12 weeks. I've done maybe 7 or 8 repair rehabs, and it's just amazing. It's so much different between the reconstruction. They recover quickly. It's not as big as surgery, and at 11 or 12 weeks, they are just ready to go. And my first one, I was unbelievably scared to do it, and they just had no problems. I've never had a repair yet. Now, again, there's not that many, 7 or 8, that have had any increased pain when they got into the throwing. But I used the same program in regards to that. I moved a little bit faster because you're looking at a return to competition in 6 months. And Jeff Dugas has done a lot of these things, and he's got a 94% return to play percentage. So and he gets them back within 6 months, sometimes a little bit earlier. Everybody's a little bit different. Sometimes it has to do with when the season is, when they actually start the season, like in the pro level. If they're ready in January, the season doesn't start till April. So you can tack on extra weeks and months because they had a chance to actually compete. And you guys and Mark, we'll talk about this on your study. You're going to see some interesting things on repairs. The percentage and what's going on there. I think what you guys are doing at the college level will be a huge influence on the pros as these guys recover from repairs and get and move up to the next level in pros. We're going to see a lot of repairs, history of repairs coming into the pro ranks.
And I'll follow up with one more.
Nope.
Sorry, Jason.
Go ahead, Craig. You're good.
Just following up with the repairs and the full reconstructions, looking at position player versus pitcher as far as time to start throwing again for a position player. Is that any different than a pitcher, both in the reconstruction and the repair? I had 2 repairs this fall. Both were position players, a catcher and an outfielder, and don't know how that affects when you would recommend starting to throw again.
Okay, well, let's just talk about the reconstruction first because we've done studies on that. We haven't really seen enough information on the repairs to give you a good answer on the position players. But the position players at the pro level, again, looking at 1,400 Tommy Johns, 90% are pitchers, 10% are position players, and the position players came back in an average of 8 or 9 months. A lot of that has to do with they can start hitting earlier and they can field and they can do things. So there's not a big lag time between the time they're ready and a pitcher who has to spend almost a month getting back into it, especially a starting pitcher. One would think, and I have a webinar that we're doing in a couple hours from now where Jeff Dugas is talking, and I will ask him that question. I will ask him that question on position players and repairs. I suspect that they're quicker, again, because they throw more sub maximal. Now, let me talk about catchers really quick. Catchers are at great risk for just about every injury. They have more injuries per capita, if you will, per position than anybody else in almost every aspect: shoulder, elbow, knees, back, everything. When we look at reconstructions, we get an 84% return to play with pitchers. Position players actually are not as good as pitchers for some reason, but catchers are 50% return to play compared to almost 85% in pitchers. Catchers have a worse return to play. And you start looking at these individual injuries, which I spend a lot of time on the epidemiology of professional injuries, and catchers always have more injuries, take longer to get back because of the demands of that position. I don't know if that answered your question.
Stan, you talk a lot about utilizing velocity how are you gauging, and obviously you have a bigger sample size than probably anybody in this room as far as the guys and where they're at in particular velos, but that person is no longer the same person that we dealt with pre-injury, right? I've seen plenty of college guys that have gone off to get these done in the summer and they come back an absolute couch potato, and have put on 20 to 30 pounds. And then other guys who have come back and they're an absolute machine and they did everything they were supposed to do. So how, I guess, are you judging what that velocity is that you want at certain stages of the rehab process?
Well, first of all, what you're talking about is if a guy is not ready to throw, not because of his surgery or his arm, but because his kinetic chain is not where it needs to be, you're putting him at some risk. You may have to take steps back to get that right if you have the time. Now, one of the things that you have to understand, though, is that when we do a reconstruction or a repair, we're trying to get back to normal anatomy and function. That's all we're trying to do. Nothing is good as stock equipment. But if a guy has a torn ligament and you reconstruct it, you've put him hopefully near the same as he was before the tear. But if he returns to doing the same things, poor mechanics, it's on all the different risk factors. And one of the biggest risk factors for primary reconstruction and revision reconstruction is velocity. So when you see a guy who throws 98 miles an hour and he blows out his ligament and he has his reconstruction and he comes back, he's not better than new, and he's probably not as good as new. He's close to being as good as new. Now, he, of course, is going to try to increase his velocity. So then the question is, how does he do that? And if he gets back to 98 miles an hour and he's using the same mechanics and doing the same things he did before, he has just as good a chance to do that. And that's why we see a lot of revisions. You can't tell him to throw less with less velocity. And this kind of then leads into a whole nother discussion on weighted balls and what do weighted balls do in regards to increasing velocity. And depending on who you want to believe, if Mike Reinold thinks that you increase external rotation, and which puts on more stress on the graft, and using a weighted ball on anybody, but even on a reconstructed elbow. So that's a whole nother quagmire of information in regards to the weighted ball program and everything else. I'm not for or against the weighted ball program. I'm actually trying to figure out all the specifics of the science behind it. I don't know. Does that answer? I don't know. Yeah, you don't come out better. You don't come out better. With a reconstruction or a repair.
Hey, Stan, you talked about a little bit about obviously judging intensity by velocity, and a lot of the throwing programs that we've all come up with have been based on number of throws to really get that intensity and the endurance that we're looking for. What is your thoughts between number of throws and having a prescribed number of throws versus spending a certain amount of time out at a certain distance? Or does it really just depend on the individual that you're working with?
Well, I think it's definitely individual and what your progression is, and what you're trying to work on. It's not just throwing; it's endurance, it's velocity, it's strength, all those things. So, if you start working with these people, I don't use I use number of throws. I don't use time. Because everybody knows this. When you start throwing, some guy throws really fast, hits the ball up the throat, the other guy twiddles around with himself and then throws. So we look at about 6 or 7 throws per minute, but everybody's different on that. I would rather they take their time and then go at number of throws. So we'll go 30 to 45 throws. We usually start at 20, 25 throws, 30 throws. And then as you start to progress, you have to decide what variable are you going to change in your program. Are you going to change intensity, which means you're going to increase miles per hour? When I increase intensity, I decrease the number of throws. Let's just say if a guy's throwing 40 throws. Okay, now remember, I don't care about distance. They can move back. I don't have a problem with that if they want to, but they can move back. So I don't care about distance as long as it's not more than 90 feet for me. Doesn't mean somebody who goes farther back is wrong. It's just that's what I do. And so I can then change those variables. If I want to keep him down, or I want to do an endurance day, I can drop him 5 miles per hour and throw 50 throws. Okay, so it depends on what you want to do. When you start looking at variables in your throwing program, you change one variable at a time each time based on what you want to accomplish in that throwing program. Okay.
Thank you.
Don't be shy.
Last one I got here for you, Stan. So obviously experiencing this earlier on and, some of the first few ones that I ever dealt with, but I know a lot of people talk about it and I've seen it as far as the 7 to 9 month while they're in their throwing phase, feeling the dreaded quote unquote pop. That a lot of people attribute to connective tissue or just extra stress on the elbow. And obviously guys jump through their own mind, especially with baseball players being the mental game that they are. But a lot of rehab protocols that I've seen that are a little more, I would say, up to date, like the Braves, for instance, have started incorporating more valgus load before the throwing program begins. And what I mean by that is, functional capacity range or functional range conditioning exercises where you're doing active isometric contractions in layback or in valgus within a controlled way. What are your thoughts on utilizing stuff like that?
Yeah, I think we do want to stress the graph. We just don't want to overstress it. I mean, it's the old Wolff's law. You want to get that graph to start maturing, and stimulating it is good. Sometimes it's hard to know where because we don't know the strength of the graph, how much to do that. Now, what you're talking about with the Braves a lot for me is stabilization exercises. That I think are critical as far as the throwing program, whether it's for the shoulder or the elbow. I don't specifically put stress on the ligament. I do that with throwing. But I think it's a reasonable thing to start thinking about stressing that. It makes me a little nervous because I'm just a nervous guy, I guess, of forcing some valgus stress on that ligament. They do it in a very graded way, so I sure as heck wouldn't criticize them for doing that. I don't really do it that much. Again, layback and external rotation is really actually based on how hard you throw. So that's why I make such a big deal on the intensity and the velocity. What we do a ton of is med balls, a lot of med balls, because it's concentric, eccentric, it's control, it's stabilization. We do them in a lot of different patterns. We do them a lot with lower extremity and pelvic rotation, trying to teach that pelvic rotation versus lumbar rotation, and there's stress placed on those. We use the med ball program a lot, but it's what we decide when it's time to throw is our progression on our med ball program. So I guess that's my answer to that one.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to say one other thing. One of the things I've seen in physical therapists, and this is not a criticism of physical therapists, I'm a physical therapist, but what we see a lot of in sports related injuries, like a player who leaves the college and goes outside to an outside PT, you got to make sure you know exactly what PT you're using. PTs, in order to function and keep the lights on and pay their employees, have to run people through 45 minutes, that kind of thing. We set up our clinic in Phoenix the exact opposite. We spend, as you guys do, 2 to 3 hours a day with our rehab people, one-on-one. So we don't turn it over. We have strength coaches that work with us and ATCs that work with us, but we do that all. And we find that if you're trying to spend 45 minutes with an athlete returning from Tommy John surgery, and you get them better, good for you. But I can't do it. I need 2 to 3 hours a session with one-on-one, making sure that they do every exercise exactly the way we want it. I also, before I leave, I want to give a shout out to Scott Stansbury. I know he's talking next. When we started that UCL program, we tried to contact a bunch of people. Scott was one of the first ones to jump on board and jumped on and called a bunch of you other guys and gals to be able to participate. And he was a huge stimulus to our program. And we don't think we could have done it without him. So I know he's talking next. Get it
Thanks,
done,
Stan.
Scott.
I appreciate that.
Anybody
Okay.
else have any more questions for Stan before we turn it on over to Scott? All right. Well, much appreciated, Stan.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate being asked to talk anytime.
So now we're going to head over to Scott, who's going to talk about draft medical info. For those of you who aren't familiar, Scott Stansbury is the current athletic trainer with Notre Dame baseball, and he assists with football. He's a 2003 graduate of Salisbury University and attended grad school at Villanova in 2005. After graduating, he served 2 years on staff at Villanova and has been at Notre Dame for 13 years. Scott also worked as part of the USA baseball program for 3 years, serving as the national team development program, as well as the Collegiate national team and the 15U national team. And take it away, Scott.
All right, thanks, Jason, and thanks everyone for your time today. I really appreciate it. No, this Stan went a little long, but I enjoyed listening to him, so hopefully I won't take too much time here. Let me try and share my presentation. Can everyone see that? Very good there. Okay. So by no means do I feel like there's this only one way to do this. This is just kind of our process here and how this has evolved over the years. Being here for 13 years, I've kind of get a good lay of the land within our athletic department and across the university, and utilizing those resources to kind of make this this part of the job, which I think is unique to our sport, and maybe in addition, maybe football being the other sport where, and basketball, I guess, too, where the information is required by the teams. But I think we're unique because a lot of them ask for it before they sign a contract. So just a process for handling and disseminating information. I don't pretend to be a lawyer, nor do I really want to be one, but I figured I'd start with this slide to kind of clarify the difference. And this was one thing that I've learned over the years. There is a significant difference between what we are dealing with on the educational side and what the standard medical community deals with in regards to HIPAA versus FERPA. HIPAA, as we all know, is the National Standard Act to protect individual medical records and how that is used and disseminated. FERPA, in contrast, applies to most of the public and private institutions, post-secondary institutions. And so with that, those records that we have treatment-wise, and bear with me for 1 second. With that, those records are excluded. The treatment records and the educational records are excluded from the HIPAA privacy rule, even if the school is covered under HIPAA. For example, an athletic training facility that might treat outside patients, faculty, staff, and bill for those services, they fall under the HIPAA, but they also fall under the FERPA when it comes to student athletes. So the treatment records fall out of the definition of educational records, but our schools may be able to disclose that information for purposes other than the student's treatment, provided that they fall under one of the exceptions to written consent. Essentially what that means is that you have to get the student's written consent before you can disseminate that information to others. So prior to 2014, my early years here, I was kind of handed the job to do this by our previous baseball athletic trainer, who's still here. But he kind of had this system, and he said, here's how we do it. Okay, great. So the scouts would request the medical information. I'd have our athletes sign our release form. Then the student athlete would review it. They'd sign off on it. I'd put together a little like summary of their issues. And then I would disseminate that either via fax or typically encrypted email to the individual scouts or organizations that requested it. And then I would track it with that information of who requested it, what the student athlete, the dates, all that sort of thing. In the fall of 2014, and this kind of came from our in-services, our preseason in-services in sports medicine, we were talking about medical records, and it kind of got me thinking about it. So I actually requested a meeting with our compliance staff and they kind of looped in our general counsel staff here on campus to talk about better practices and how we could better handle this particular release of medical information as it related to baseball. And so had a really productive meeting with them. The guy that came over is fantastic, younger guy that really understood the importance of this and the reason why. So he took all the information back and kind of came up with some language and a more effective or protective, I guess you could say, release form that kind of protected the student athlete and the university as it related to the FERPA rules. So I think that, and again, one of the reasons why we did it was because we're one of the few sports where scouts are so heavily involved in pre-draft evaluation and looking at medical records within the organizations that I just felt this was probably a really good way of making sure that we're protecting the student athlete and their medical records. And it actually allowed us to kind of revamp the system a little bit and provide a more complete system. And like I say at the bottom there, like leave it to the lawyers. We're lucky here at Notre Dame. A lot of our compliance staff does have a law background. So they're super helpful and they understand kind of our role. And they're not really, they're not the typical, rule abide buyers, but they want to make sure that we're doing things the right way within the rule of law. So since that time, again, similar process. We've changed the medical release form. The language that Brandon, our guy from General Counsel, included or added to what we could send out is specific to each team, and I'll explain that here in a little bit. And again, it's just kind of made it just more protective of the university. Haven't really changed the system so much, just kind of what the release form and the legal side of it looks like. And correct me, I may be wrong on my dates here. I was trying to ask a few people. Around 2017 or 2018, I think were the early stages of what is now the draft prospect link. I think there were a lot of rough first versions of that with a lot of flaws, but it was one of the results from the current collective bargaining agreement, which was signed in November of 2016. But I know that there were a lot of different language or terminology kind of missteps in that initial questionnaire and different things. But I will say it does make it a lot easier from a medical records standpoint. One of the things that I think was tough was getting 30 requests for one player. Now that the questionnaire has kind of become currently now we have one medical questionnaire for all 30 teams. The draft prospect link now allows us to upload for the student athlete as the athletic trainer as a proxy, but also the student athlete can do it by themselves and they can answer the questions by themselves and those sorts of things. And so I think that's been super helpful. One thing that I did want to mention, the draft prospect link, I think when you look it up, it kind of says it's the top 300 drafts or draft prospects. But this year was a unique year. Early on, I got a notification from each of my players that were draft eligible, and I know that not all of them fall into the top 300, but any of our juniors and seniors got a invitation to do this. So I think they're moving towards putting everyone under this and just having all of the medical records into one location. But again, I think part of the CBA now is requiring that teams or scouts are required to use this to get any medical records. And I think where I read was that the teams they highlight people within their organization that are allowed to access the medical records. This is just a form that I found online, actually on the NATA website. It's a prospect link information and then a frequently asked questions. I thought this was helpful. It may be helpful for some of you. If you just Google NATA draft prospect link, this will pop up. But I thought it was super helpful and just kind of answers a lot of questions. And I may actually start using this as part of my introduction to our juniors who are draft eligible, just so that they understand kind of what they're getting into. So just to give you some background on what we do here, in the fall, after our welcome back team meeting, whatever that might be, I'll meet with all of our draft eligible players as a big group prior to the start of our fall season. I'll kind of talk through the process with them, how things are going to go, and then answer any initial questions. The one thing that I do kind of mention to them early on is to be upfront and honest when they're answering questions, whether it's from a scout in an interview or when they're filling out their medical information. And I tell them this simply because it will help them in the long run. If they want to try and hide something, it may not necessarily serve them well when a team's trying to invest money in them long term. They want to make sure they're an honest and trustworthy individual to the team right from the start. So that's kind of what I encourage to them. And then the juniors obviously would sign the release form. Our general counsel felt it was appropriate to do it for 2 years, given that some juniors might not be drafted and would have to come back, would come back for their senior year. So we make it good for 2 years, and then obviously the outliers, the fifth years that might come back and have an opportunity to play professionally, I would have them sign a new one during their fifth year. And then sometime between, I say January here, but sometime in between, December, November, January, somewhere around there, most guys will get an invite to the draft prospect link. Each player completes their own questionnaire. I ask them to kind of come into the office and do it with me. They may just pull their laptop while they're getting treatment. In doing so, mostly I do that just so that they make sure that the information is accurate and complete, or they may have trouble with a question or not understand what the question's asking them. And so I think that that's something that's helpful. If you have time to do it, certainly do it. And then once that's completed, then I take their medical information and I put together a draft medical record for each athlete that kind of has the prospect link invite. This includes the release form, a brief summary of their medical issues and injuries, any physician notes, dictations, imaging studies, reports, operative notes, and then any other documentation that might be pertinent. Then at the conclusion of that, I'll gather that all up, put that in a PDF file. Then I'll have the athlete review it. They sign off on it. And then it's uploaded as one document into the prospect link under their name and it says medical record, so that they can access, so that it's easily accessible to the teams that want to look at it. If there are any changes or additions to that from that point on, I'll upload a separate document with a similar thing that will just say addendum that will include anything pertinent during that particular season. So for instance, this year, I had 2 or 3 guys that I had to fill out addendums for because they had injuries that happened in the first 4 weeks that we were going on. Briefly, what is shared, non-orthopedic issues, things that teams may want to be interested in or want to know about. ADD and ADHD is a big thing with the testing now. Vision issues, contacts, eyewear, if they need them to play, those types of things, and then any other general medical issues or concerns, such as the autoimmune diseases or any time loss illnesses such as mono or something along those lines. That it just, again, brief summary. This is when it happened. This is what the diagnosis was, and kind of roll from there. Orthopedic time loss injuries is really what I hit on probably the most. And again, brief summaries of that, time, dates, how the rehab went. Again, just being brief and trying to be as as brief and concise as possible. And then any other orthopedic injuries that might require additional imaging. You get an ankle sprain on a Friday night that you need an x-ray for. If there's an x-ray and a doctor eval, you certainly want to include that. This is all from their time of their arrival on campus to the time that we fill it out. Anything prior to that, I just encourage the student athlete to get those records. Most of the parents now probably have those records. And so I just encourage them to upload them to the prospect link separately. This is an example of our form on the left. Excuse me. And this was the new form that we kind of filled out that came from our general counsel. It kind of is all encompassing because it just says professional sports organization. And we use this across the board now within our athletic department for basketball, football, etc. So at the bottom there, professional sports organizations. Our general counsel felt it was sufficient to just include all MLB organizations, and at the time, the MLB Scouting Bureau, which is still, I think that might still be there. Still might be some remnants of that, but that's kind of what we include. So the student athlete signs that, the date, and I keep that on record for 2 years. I have a whole folder of just draft related stuff. On the right is the language that we included with any faxes or emails that went out prior to the draft prospect link being included or being a part of this. So this language itself is specific to FERPA and essentially says that the organization understands that they will comply with the FERPA rules and regulations, which it just requires the student's written consent to release information outside of that particular organization that is viewing the records. So what I did with that language, and it's not in the next slide, but in this pre-draft medical form, I include that language between where basically in the top of that little note at the top. This is kind of an example of a pre-draft medical record that I would fill out. There would be, again, quick summaries of the injury itself. If it's surgical in nature, obviously I would put in the date of the surgery and try and give a brief summation of who performed it. I don't really get into details other than saying they were treated conservatively and were successful. Because again, I think a lot of that falls into what the documentation is going to show on the back end. And then I think on the right-hand side there is the second page of it. The student athlete signs it, I sign it, date it, and then these 2 pages, in addition to any of the documentation, the notes and the X-ray reports and the op reports and those sorts of things are added to this behind this as pages. And again, the athlete has the opportunity before they sign it to review all of this and see what it says so that they know what is getting. In addition to that, I also actually have them, I send them a digital copy of the entire PDF file, including all their notes, because ultimately it is their record and they have access to it. So that's kind of how we handle the draft medical. And then all of this is uploaded to the prospect. And then I keep track of it in a simple Google sheet. It may look something like this, where I put the name, when they signed the release form, when they completed the questionnaire, and when we uploaded their file. I do this mostly because if a team asks or has asked in the past, like, they can, hey, it was uploaded on this date, and they can go back and look at it. And I do this to keep track of that. And also for our general counsel, they thought it was a good idea to keep track of what we're sending out and when we're sending it out. And then once the season completes, on the left-hand side is a permission to release educational record information. This came directly from our general counsel. This is the added step that we have to do here. Our general counsel just asked that we fill this form out and submit it back to them, letting them know what we've released out of Notre Dame. And so we'll complete this as well. Again, any medical addendums are uploaded to the prospect link, and then I complete this form and I send it on to our contact in general counsel office. so that they can keep it on file. They don't request us to, or they don't require us, I guess I should say, to send everything that we send out because they know that we have that on file here in our EMR system. So they just ask for this form to be completed, which again is an extra step for us, but it's kind of what they've asked us to do. Just some final thoughts. I think it's important to involve your institution's compliance staff and general counsel, let them help you and kind of make sure that you're, falling under the right guidelines and rules as it relates to FERPA. It's with the legal things that are coming about now, I think it's even more important to make sure that, we're doing things the right way and making sure that our documentation, number one, is appropriate, but also that, we're doing things the right way by disseminating that information. And then also there may be some university specific guidelines that may fall under. For instance, for us, we have to fill out that second release form. We do that. The student athlete doesn't have to do that, but those are just things that may fall with your particular institution. So I would encourage you again to make sure that you know what's required of you at your institution. And then the last thing I think that's important, and I learned this over the years, is just educating the athlete on why a process like this is important and the importance of accurate and complete information. In my friends that are in professional baseball, over the years, I've kind of picked their brain about this stuff. And, the biggest thing that they've said is making sure that it's accurate and complete, and that they want people to tell them about things so that they don't find out about it later, because like I said before, once a team invests money, they're not going to be too happy with it if something if the athlete isn't truthful or something along those lines. So that's all I have as far as the process. If anyone has any questions or things, there's my email. Feel free to reach out if you need an example of something. I'm happy to provide a template or something for you all as we go forward. But that's all I have. Happy to answer any questions.
Scott, Sean Boland here from UGA. Have you had any advisors reach out in any capacity through your student athletes that advise you not to upload the information?
No, I haven't. I haven't had any experience with that. We had a guy, this was prior to 2014. We had a guy that injured himself late in the season, and I actually had a great relationship with that advisor prior to, so it actually worked out great. But we had a conversation of what we were going to release to the teams at that point. Obviously, that was 6 years ago, so it's quite different. What I typically do is I will talk to the student athlete and ask them if they have an advisor or not. I think that's important for us to know. And then also, I encourage them when I give them a copy of their medical record to let their advisor know, because they're the ones that are going to talk to them. I'll let them talk to the advisor and say, hey, this is the medical that my athletic trainer put together for me. And I'll say, hey, give your advisor a copy of it too, so they know what's going on. But I haven't had anyone specifically say, advisor or anyone say, we don't want this to go. I've had conversations with parents to say, like, we want this information to go through. Like, we had a kid this past summer that went to like 3 different physicians for an evaluation on an arm, and it was like they just wanted the one doctor's evaluation. And I was like, that's fine. It's your record, whatever we want to disseminate. Now, we have record of all 3 visits, but they just wanted to disseminate the one. So.
Anybody else have anything for Scott?
Scott, I've got a question for you. This is Callie from Toledo. I also work summer ball here on the Cape. Do you have any suggestions for kind of adapting this process where they just have so much access to our guys, and especially I've had a lot of trouble educating our coaches on what they should and shouldn't or can and can't say to scouts kind of in passing. Do you have any suggestions for kind of those informal conversations that tend to happen?
Yeah, I've obviously being here long enough, I kind of built a relationship with a lot of the regional scouts here, in the Midwest. And really, I just try and be as, a lot of scouts will try and ask questions, but I try to be as honest without giving too much information, like too much detailed information, because I think most of those guys, for the most part, the guys that I've worked with here in the Midwest are pretty astute and like know that they can get the information, the detailed in that we're going to give them detailed information, so they're going to get detailed information on our guys. So I try to be as like, I don't know what the word is, just kind of like as honest with them, but not as detailed, I guess is a good way to put it, and not get too complex with what we're talking about. Or I may try and talk in some generalities versus versus like details. That makes sense. But are you talking more like in the like summer ball?
Yeah, more summer ball where, those coaches, like I'll walk into our AT room and, coaches in there with 3 different scouts and they'll, hey, Cal, like what can you tell us? And obviously my gut response is if I don't have written permission, I'm not saying anything.
Yeah.
But where coaches are kind of not going rogue, but doing their own little kind of backdoor conversations, we're trying to limit still having that, privacy, but giving the guys the access that they need.
Yeah, I think it might be a good thing to like maybe just have a quick sit down with them, your coaches. We have a new staff this year, so that was one of the things that I talked about with our new staff. But just having a conversation with the coaching staff, whether it's at summer ball or your own school, about making sure everyone's on the same page with how the information wants to be disseminated. Or in our instance, we talked about if the scout asks anything medical, like the coaches know that they can direct the scouts to me, and I have it that the athlete has signed off saying that they'll let me talk to the scouts about it, so I can kind of talk about it then. So I would encourage maybe just a conversation with that coaching staff, summer ball, like, hey, if anybody asks, like just send them my way, and then you can kind of talk to the athlete and say, hey, is this okay if a scout asks me? Just talk to individual athletes versus like maybe a collective group.
Thanks.
All right. Well, I think that's all we got. Really appreciate you taking the time to put that together, Scott.
Hey, thank you.
So kind of similar to last week, I'm going to take this video and toss it up on YouTube because it seems like that worked a little better than sending over a Google Doc. Next week, we're going to do same time, same place, since that seems to be the reoccurring theme on how everybody's voting. Our first presentation, which hopefully time frame wise works for everybody at 1 o'clock, will be Eric Cressy, and he's going to be joined by the Yankees head of strength and conditioning and their medical director. On top of that, we're going to have Mark Rothermick talk afterwards. If you guys aren't familiar with Mark, Mark's the guy that headed up the UCL study for the collegiate ranks, and he works over at ASMI. Other than that, if anybody has any questions, feel free to hop on the CBATS email and fire away.
Thanks, guys. Enjoyed it.
Thanks, everyone.